The scent of rain on hot dust was a liar's promise in the Arizona territory. Nantan knew this. He had been born with the knowledge in his bones, a wisdom passed down from ancestors who had watched the sky for generations. It was a smell that spoke of life, but often delivered death. He stood on a low ridge, his body still as the saguaro beside him. His gaze fixed not on the bruised purple clouds to the west, but on the tracks in the dry wash below. 3 mares, a stallion, and a new colt. The wild ones. Their prints were sharp, fresh. He had been following them for 2 days, not to capture, but to watch, to remember a freedom that felt more distant with each passing year. His focus was absolute, a quiet intensity that was his nature. He registered the world in layers, the scuttling of a lizard over rock, the distant cry of a hawk, the way the wind grew suddenly cool and carried the damp smell of creosote, and beneath it all, the lie. The clouds were too dark, too heavy for a gentle summer shower. They held a violence that the land was not ready for. The ground here was baked hard as pottery. It would not drink the water. It would shed it. A low rumble, more felt than heard, vibrated up through the soles of his worn moccasins. It was not thunder. It was the sound of a world about to move. He shifted his weight, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the bough slung across his back. His plan had been simple: follow the horses until they led him to a new water source, then turn back toward the quiet wickiup that was his home. Live quietly. Stay apart. That was the only way to live now. The rumble grew into a hiss, then a roar. He looked down toward dry Cottonwood Creek, a name that was usually an honest one. Now, a thread of muddy water appeared, then another. They braided together, thickening, a trickle becoming a stream. It was not a creek anymore. It was a brown serpent, and it was growing fat with impossible speed. Then he heard it, the splintering crack of wood and a human scream, thin and sharp against the water's deepening voice. His eyes snapped toward the sound. Downstream, where the old wagon trail crossed the wash. A mail coach was caught. The horses screamed, their terror a terrible sound. As the rising water, now a churning wall of red mud and debris, slammed into the vehicle, the coach, so sturdy and defiant on dry land, was a child's toy. It shuddered, lifted, and then surrendered, tipping onto its side with a final groan of snapping timber. The lead horses were dragged under, their struggle mercifully short. For a long moment, Nantan did not move. This was not his fight. This was the world of the white man, of straight roads and timed schedules. And it had met the world of the desert, which had no schedule at all. To interfere was to invite trouble, and trouble was a guest that never left. He had seen enough trouble to last a lifetime. He should turn away. He should melt back into the canyons and let the water have what it had claimed. Another cry, weaker this time, but distinctly human, a woman's voice. His body moved before his mind had finished the argument. He was down the ridge in a series of fluid, ground-eating strides, his moccasins finding purchase on the slick, wet rock. The air was thick with the smell of churned earth and wet wood. The water was a torrent now, carrying entire trees, their roots clawing at the air like drowned men. The wrecked coach was snagged on a cluster of ancient cottonwoods, half submerged in the filthy current. He saw a flash of color, a calico dress tangled in the wreckage. A woman was clinging to a broken wheel, her face pale, her hair a dark, wet mess plastered to her skin. Her eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond screaming. Not far from her, a small boy, no more than 7 or 8 summers, held fast to the coach's leather roof strap, his dark Yavapai face a mask of silent shock. Nantan waded into the flood. The pull was immense, a physical force trying to tear him from his feet. The water was cold, a shock against his warm skin, and it was thick with silt, almost like moving through wet cement. He fought his way to the coach, his muscles straining. He reached the woman first. "Give me your hand," he said, his voice calm and low, barely audible over the roar. She stared at him, her eyes uncomprehending for a second. He was not what she expected. He was Apache, his features carved by sun and wind, his black hair held back by a simple leather band. There was no pity in his face, only a fierce, focused calm. That calm was more reassuring than any empty promise would have been. She released her grip on the wheel and reached for him. Her hand was small and cold in his. He pulled her free of the snagging debris, half carrying, half dragging her through the powerful current toward the relative safety of the bank. The red mud sucked at their feet, trying to hold them. He set her down on solid ground. She coughed, spitting out muddy water, her body trembling. "Jonah," she gasped, pointing back at the wreck. "The boy—" Nantan was already moving. He plunged back into the water, his movements economical, wasting no energy. He reached the boy, who looked at him with wide, trusting eyes. Nantan spoke a few words in the boy's own tongue, soft words of reassurance. The boy let go of the strap and wrapped his thin arms around Nantan's neck. Carrying the child was easier, but the water was still a relentless enemy. He fought his way back, the boy's small weight a precious, fragile burden. He placed Jonah next to the woman, who immediately drew the boy into her arms, murmuring to him, her own fear momentarily forgotten in her need to comfort. "The driver," she said, looking at Nantan. "Silas." He was inside. Nantan looked at the coach. It was shifting, groaning under the pressure. The cottonwoods holding it would not last forever. Getting inside would be a fool's errand, but he went anyway. He climbed onto the side of the submerged coach, the wood slick with mud. He peered through a shattered window into the dark, watery interior. An old man was wedged between a seat and a stack of mail sacks, his chest unnaturally still. Water lapped around his chin. With a grunt of effort, Nantan tore the broken door from its one remaining hinge and lowered himself inside. The driver was alive, but barely. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and cloudy with pain. "Legs," the old man wheezed, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "Broke." Nantan knew a death wound when he saw one. He could not move the man alone, and even if he could, it would only hasten the end. There was nothing to be done. "They behind us," Silas whispered, his breath catching. "Riders." Nantan met the old man's gaze. He understood. These were not casual words. They were a warning. "The mail, a special pouch for Miss Hart," the driver rasped. "Important." His eyes closed. His final breath was a quiet sigh that the floodwaters swallowed. Nantan climbed out of the coach, his face grim. He made his way back to the bank. The woman looked at him, a question in her eyes that she did not need to speak. He shook his head slowly. "He is gone." Her shoulders slumped, and she hugged the boy tighter. The rain began to lessen, the violent downpours softening to a persistent drizzle. The roar of the flood was already receding, its fury spent. In its wake, it left a scene of utter devastation. The landscape was painted in one color, a thick, uniform coat of red mud. "I am Eliza Hart," the woman said, her voice shaky but clear. She was a schoolteacher, bound for Red Mesa. This boy, Jonah, was her student. She was returning him to his family, who lived in a small village not far from the town. Her words were simple, factual, as if clinging to the ordinary could somehow ward off the horror of what had just happened. Nantan merely nodded, his eyes scanning the opposite bank of the now shrinking creek. The driver's words echoed in his mind. Riders, he saw them now in his mind's eye. A faceless threat somewhere back on the trail. As the water level dropped, more of the coach was revealed. Eliza pointed to a sturdy leather trunk and a satchel that had been wedged in the luggage rack, miraculously still there. "My things," she said, "and the mail pouch Silas mentioned. He asked me to keep it with my personal bags for safekeeping." Nantan waded out one last time, the water now only thigh-deep. He worked the trunk free and hauled it to the bank. It was heavy, filled with books. He guessed. He retrieved the satchel as well. It was a simple, well-made bag. And inside, along with some of Eliza's personal effects, was a sealed oilskin pouch bearing the official markings of the United States Mail Service. It looked no different from any other mail pouch. Yet Silas had spent his last breath on it. Eliza took it, her expression one of weary duty. It was a responsibility she had accepted, and she would see it through. She had no idea what was inside, and at that moment, she did not care. She was cold, exhausted, and her world had been reduced to the survival of the small boy shivering in her arms. The rain stopped. A watery sun broke through the clouds, making the wet world steam. The air was clean and sharp. Nantan walked a little way down the bank, his eyes to the ground. He found what he was looking for almost immediately. On a patch of ground that the flood had not reached, there were hoofprints. 4 riders. Their horses were shod. American horses, and they had been moving fast. He could tell by the depth of the prints and the spacing of the strides. They had been chasing the coach. Silas had been right. He walked back to Eliza and Jonah. She had managed to get the trunk open and was pulling out a dry wool blanket to wrap around the boy. She looked up at Nantan, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. They were strangers, from different worlds, thrown together by a catastrophe. In her world, a man like him was a figure of fear, a ghost from the wild lands. But he had saved her life. He had saved Jonah. "We cannot stay here," Nantan said. His voice was flat, stating a fact, not offering an opinion. "Red Mesa is a day's walk. Hard walking." "I know," she replied, her chin lifting with a resolve he had not expected. "We have to get Jonah home, and I have to deliver this mail." She held up the oilskin pouch for a moment before placing it carefully back in her satchel. Nantan looked at her, then at the boy, and finally at the vast, silent, and now listening desert around them. His plan for a quiet life had been washed away with the mail coach. He had not asked for this. He had not wanted to be responsible for anyone but himself. But the flood had made a choice for him. It had swept away his solitude and left him with these 2 people, a dying man's warning, and the heavy feeling that the water was only the first of their problems. A line had been drawn in the red mud, and he now stood on the same side of it as the schoolteacher and the Yavapai boy. He did not know where it would lead, only that turning back was no longer an option. The sun rose on a world washed clean and raw. The air, stripped of dust, was sharp in their lungs. Nantan moved first, his uneasy motion that spoke of a body accustomed to waking on hard ground. He stood and looked east, his face unreadable as the new light etched long shadows from the mesas. The flood had passed, leaving a wide, glistening scar of red mud that was already beginning to crack and dry under the morning sun. What remained of the mail coach was a skeleton of splintered wood, a monument to the water's brief, savage power. Eliza was already awake, though she had not moved. She had spent the night in a state of shallow, fitful sleep, with Jonah curled against her side, his small body a warm, living anchor in the disorienting aftermath. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, unfamiliar soreness. She was a woman of books and chalkboards, of straight-backed chairs and ordered rooms. Her body was not made for this. "We go now," Nantan said, not looking at her. His gaze was distant, scanning the horizon. "The ground is soft. It will hold our tracks. We will take the old mule path. It is harder, but fewer men use it." There was no discussion. His words were not a suggestion, but a statement of reality. Eliza pushed herself to a sitting position, her movements stiff. She helped Jonah to his feet, whispering words of encouragement as he blinked sleep from his eyes. Nantan had already salvaged what little was edible from the coach's waterlogged supply box, a handful of hard biscuits, softened to a near pulp. They ate in silence, the meager meal doing little to quiet the unease in Eliza's stomach. Nantan took up her heavy trunk in one fluid motion. settling it on his shoulder as if it were a simple bedroll. He gave the small satchel, the one containing the oilskin mail pouch, back to her. The weight of it felt different now, heavier with the memory of Silas's last words. The mule path was little more than a suggestion of a trail, a faint line winding up from the wash and into the broken country of rock and scrub. The walking was brutal. The mud of the creek bed gave way to loose shale that slid under Eliza's thin-soled shoes, and then to hard-baked earth littered with sharp rocks. For Jonah, it was a familiar landscape, and he moved with a child's surprising endurance. For Eliza, it was an agony. She felt clumsy, loud, her every step a clumsy announcement of her presence. Nantan moved ahead of them, a silent, watchful guide. He would pause every so often, his body going utterly still, his head cocked as if listening to a conversation she could not hear. Then he would motion them forward again, several times. He led them off the path entirely, onto wide shelves of flat rock where their feet would leave no impression. "You walk too loud," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. He had stopped and turned to face her. "You think with your feet. You must think with the ground." He pointed to her shoes. "Your heels strike first. That is the sound of a hammer. You must walk on the front of your foot, like a deer. Place it, then give it your weight." He demonstrated, his own steps making no sound at all. He seemed to glide over the rocky terrain. Eliza tried to imitate him, feeling foolish and self-conscious. Her steps were still clumsy, but they were quieter. "Good," he said, the single word a small, unexpected piece of praise. "Now watch." He led her to a patch of sand that had collected in a hollow between two boulders. He walked across it, leaving clear prints. Then he knelt, and with a branch of greasewood, he gently brushed the surface, his movements following the direction of the faint morning breeze. The prints vanished, leaving the sand looking undisturbed. The wind is your friend. It can hide you or it can tell your story to anyone who knows how to read it. A cold knot formed in Eliza's stomach. This was not a lesson in walking. It was a lesson in hiding. "Who are we hiding from?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The men who were following you," Nantan replied simply. He had backtracked to the main trail during one of their pauses, and his eyes had confirmed what he suspected. 4 riders. They were moving steadily, not with the urgency of a posse, but with the patient certainty of hunters who know their prey is on foot and has nowhere to go. They follow the mail coach. Now, they will follow us. The knowledge settled over them, a silence more profound than the vast emptiness of the desert. The journey took on a new, desperate quality. Every shadow could be a man. Every gust of wind could be the sound of approaching horses. Nantan pushed them harder, his silences more intense, his glances backward more frequent. By late afternoon, Jonah was stumbling with fatigue, and even Nantan's steady pace had slowed under the weight of the trunk. Ahead, nestled in a fold of the hills, was a low adobe building with a sagging corral next to it. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. "Munoz," Nantan said. "He trades horses. He will let us rest." Old man Munoz was as weathered and cracked as the land he lived on. He had a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. He looked from Nantan to Eliza and the boy, his expression giving nothing away. He and Nantan exchanged a few words in Spanish, too rapid for Eliza to follow. Finally, Munoz grunted and nodded toward the adobe. "The woman can help with the boy," he said in heavily accented English. Inside, the small way station was cool and dark. A woman in the simple gray habit of a nun was sitting at a rough wooden table, mending a tear in a man's shirt. She looked up as they entered, and her face, serene and kind, broke into a small smile. "Sister Agnes," she introduced herself. "You look as if you have wrestled with a river and lost." Eliza felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Here was a small piece of the world she understood. Sister Agnes took Jonah from her, clucking softly as she examined a scrape on his knee. She cleaned it with a damp cloth and gave him a piece of hard candy from a pocket in her habit. Then she turned her attention to Eliza, tending to the cuts on her hands and the deep weariness in her eyes with a practiced, gentle efficiency, while Sister Agnes cared for them. Nantan spoke quietly with Munoz by the door. Their voices were low, but Eliza caught a few words. Corbin Hale, Judge Lyle, Red Mesa. Later, as Eliza sipped a cup of hot, bitter tea that Sister Agnes had prepared, the nun sat down across from her. "You are in some trouble, my child," she said softly. "We were in a flood," Eliza said, not wanting to say more. "The flood is not the only trouble you face," Sister Agnes corrected her gently. "Mr. Munoz tells me that Corbin Hale has been buying friends in high places. He hosted a very expensive dinner for Judge Lyle in San Miguel last month. It seems the judge's rulings have been very favorable to Mr. Hale's land interests ever since." The words confirmed the vague fear that had been growing in Eliza. The riders, the dying driver's warning, the mail pouch in her bag, it was all connected. A web she had stumbled into without even realizing it. Red Mesa, her destination, the place she thought of as a refuge, might be the most dangerous place of all. They rested for only a few hours. As dusk began to settle, Nantan knew they had to move on. They could not risk the riders finding them there and bringing trouble to Munoz and the sister. As Eliza gathered her satchel, Sister Agnes took her aside, near the doorway where the shadows were deepest. "The world is not always as it seems," the nun whispered, her calm eyes serious. She pressed something small and cold into Eliza's palm. Eliza looked down. It was a brass key, ornate and old-fashioned. "There is a safe deposit box at the post office in Red Mesa. It is registered to a name you will not recognize, but this is the key." Eliza stared at her, confused. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because Silas was a good man," Sister Agnes said. "He sometimes held things for people who feared keeping them in their own homes. He told me that if anything ever happened to him on this run, I should find a way to get this key to the person carrying his special pouch." Her gaze was direct and steady. "When you get to Red Mesa, you will know what you need to open. Be careful, child. Justice in this territory is a flickering candle, easily extinguished." Before Eliza could ask more, the nun squeezed her hand and stepped back, her face once again composed and serene. The key felt heavy in Eliza's pocket, a weight of secrets added to the burden of survival. They left the way station and walked into the deepening twilight. Nantan led them to a sheltered alcove at the base of a tall, dark mesa. The rock still held the heat of the day, and it radiated a gentle warmth into the cooling air. He gathered dry wood from the base of a skeletal mesquite tree and, with a skill that seemed like magic to Eliza, started a small, smokeless fire. It was a tiny circle of light and warmth in an immense, dark world. They ate the last of the biscuits and some dried meat Nantan produced from a pouch at his belt. Jonah, exhausted, fell asleep almost immediately, his head in Eliza's lap, for a long time. Eliza and Nantan sat in silence, watching the flames. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a deep-seated weariness she had not seen before. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was bolder than she intended, born of the strange intimacy of the fire and the shared danger. He did not answer at first, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice was low, devoid of self-pity. "I was not always alone. I was at the mission school at San Carlos. They taught me to read your words, to speak your God's name." He paused. "They also brought the sickness, the spotted fever. I watched my friends, the other boys. I watched them burn with it. One day we were learning to write our names. The next, they were being put in the ground. I was one of the few who lived." He picked up a small stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. "I learned then that their words and their God were not strong enough to stop death. I learned that their world brings promises it cannot keep It is better to be alone. The desert does not make promises. It simply is. Eliza listened, her heart aching for the boy he must have been. She saw him not as a fearsome Apache warrior, but as a lonely survivor. She wanted him to understand that her world was not only made of broken promises. My world has promises too, she said softly. I believe in them. I believe that knowledge can be a shield. That is why I became a teacher. She told him about her own past, about growing up in a crowded city back east, where knowledge was a luxury. She spoke of her dream to bring books to children who had never held one. Before I came to Red Mesa, I wrote letters to every church and ladies' auxiliary I could think of. I asked them to send me their old books, and they did, boxes of them. I built the shelves myself. It is not a grand library, but it is a start. It is a promise that a child's world can be bigger than the dusty street in front of his house. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than watchful caution in his eyes. It was a flicker of understanding, of shared humanity. They were so different. A man who had retreated from the world and a woman who was trying to build a new one. Yet here they were, sharing a fire, their lives bound together by a flash flood and the unseen men who followed their tracks in the cold sand. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The trust between them was as fragile and as necessary as that small flame, a tiny point of light that they had to shield together against the vast, encroaching darkness. Red Mesa announced itself not with a welcome but with a warning. The town was a gash of raw, red earth carved into the vast, indifferent landscape. Its single main street was a wide river of dust that rose in choking clouds with every gust of wind and every passing wagon. Buildings of weathered wood and sun-bleached adobe huddled together as if for protection, their false fronts like tired masks. From the moment they stepped onto that street, they were on a stage, and every window held a pair of watching eyes. The change was immediate and palpable. Out in the desert, they had been survivors, a small, self-contained unit. Here, they were a spectacle. Nantan, carrying the heavy trunk, became not a savior but a threat. Eliza, the respectable schoolmarm, became a fallen woman in the town's silent, instantaneous judgment. And Jonah, a quiet boy returning home, became a living symbol of their transgression. Nantan felt the stares like a physical touch, a series of small, sharp pricks against his skin. He had known it would be this way. He had lived with these looks his entire life. But seeing them directed at Eliza ignited a slow, cold anger within him. His expression did not change. His face remained a stoic mask. But his eyes missed nothing. He saw the way the blacksmith stopped hammering to watch them pass, the way two women in bonnets pulled their children closer and whispered behind their hands. His grip on the trunk's leather handle tightened. Eliza felt it too. She heard the whispers, snippets of venom that floated on the dusty air. The schoolteacher, with an Apache, shameless. She lifted her chin, her back straightening with a defiant pride she did not feel. She had always believed in the decency of people, in the power of reason and community. Red Mesa was challenging that belief with every step she took. She wanted to shout at them, to explain the flood, the dead driver, the heroism of the man walking beside her. But she knew it would be useless. Their minds were already made, their verdicts passed. Their first instinct was to find the law. They saw the sign for Judge Lyle's office, and the memory of Sister Agnes's warning was a cold hand on Eliza's shoulder. Corbin Hale's dinner guest, not a refuge, not a source of justice. They walked past the door, the feeling of being watched intensifying. Across the street, the Spur Saloon was already doing brisk business, its bat-wing doors swinging open and shut, spilling the sounds of rough laughter and tinny piano music into the street. A man leaned in the doorway, his hat pulled low. He was tall, with a lean, hungry look. He watched them with an unnerving stillness, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Nantan met his gaze for a fraction of a second. There was no curiosity in the man's eyes. Only a cold, professional assessment. This was one of the hunters. Nantan knew it with a certainty that went deeper than thought. "The post office," Eliza said, her voice low and tight, forcing a sense of purpose into their movements. "I have to deliver the mail." The post office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of paper and sealing wax. The postmaster, a balding man named Henderson with nervous, darting eyes, peered at them over his spectacles. His gaze flickered from Eliza's torn and mud-stained dress to Nantan's Apache features, and a look of distinct alarm crossed his face. "Miss Hart," he stammered, We heard the coach was lost. A terrible tragedy." "It was," Eliza said, her voice steady. "The driver, Silas. He did not survive, but he asked me to deliver this." She placed the oilskin pouch on the counter. Henderson picked it up as if it were a hot coal. He glanced nervously out the window toward the saloon. "Yeah, of course. Official business." He scurried to put it in a locked bin behind the counter. Eliza's heart was hammering against her ribs. She took a breath and placed the small brass key Sister Agnes had given her on the counter. "There is a private box," she said, keeping her voice even. "I need to access it." The postmaster's face went pale. He stared at the key as if it were a snake. "That box. It belongs to a Mr. Smith. He has not been here in months." "I have the key," Eliza stated simply. Henderson licked his dry lips. He was a man caught between two fears, the fear of official procedure and a greater, more immediate fear of the powerful men who truly ran his town. He looked out the window again, his eyes wide. The man from the saloon doorway was now standing on the boardwalk directly across the street, making no pretense of his interest. "Please," Eliza said, her voice softening slightly. "It is important." Nantan had not said a word. He simply stood near the door, a silent, imposing presence. He was not threatening, yet his stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat could be. Finally, with a trembling hand, Henderson took the key and led them to a wall of small, locked boxes. He fumbled with the lock for a moment before the small door swung open. The box was not empty. Inside lay a slim portfolio of documents, tied with a ribbon. Eliza took it out, her fingers clumsy with a mixture of dread and anticipation. They stepped back to the counter, and she untied the ribbon. Nantan stood beside her, his body shielding her from the view of the street. The top document was a contract. The legal language was dense, but the names were clear. Corbin Hale, representing the Western Expansion Railroad Company, and Judge Martin Lyle, acting on behalf of the county. It was a bill of sale for a large tract of land designated only by survey coordinates. Beneath the contract was a map, hand-drawn with a surveyor's precise skill. It was a topographical chart of the region, and in the center of it, nestled in a deep, protected canyon, was an area marked in blue. A series of lines radiated from it, indicating underground springs. The label at the bottom read, "Cedar Draw Valley, sole reliable water source." It was the lifeblood of the entire region, the water that sustained the ranches, the small farms, and the tribal lands for 50 miles in every direction. And according to the contract she held in her hand, it had been sold quietly, before any official announcement, before any public auction. It was theft, sanitized with a legal signature. The mail pouch Silas had died to protect had been a decoy. The real prize was this. Just then, the bell in the small white church at the end of the street began to toll, a slow, lonely sound marking the hour. It felt like a countdown. "You have what you came for," Henderson whispered, his voice pleading. "Please, you must go." They stepped back out into the hostile sunlight. The man from the saloon, Decker, was still there. He was no longer alone. 2 other hard-faced men had joined him. They did not move to intercept them, but their presence was a promise of violence. They were herding them, not yet ready to close the trap. "We need help," Eliza said to Nantan, her voice barely audible. "The law." The law is a wolf that guards the sheep for a price, Nantan said, his eyes on the men across the street. And Hale has paid the price. There is a marshal, Eliza insisted, remembering the sign she had seen next to the judge's office. Not the judge, a town marshal. The marshal's office was small and clean. Behind the desk sat a woman. She was in her late 40s, with hair more gray than brown pulled back in a severe bun. A worn star was pinned to her leather vest, and a practical, heavy-handled revolver was holstered at her hip. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they held the same kind of watchful intelligence Eliza had seen in Nantan's. "Marshal Etta Finch," she said, her voice raspy and direct. She did not rise. "You are the schoolteacher. The whole town is buzzing about your dramatic entrance." There was no judgment in her tone, only a weary statement of fact. Eliza quickly explained everything. The flood, Silas's death, the riders, the key from Sister Agnes, and the documents they had found. She laid the contract and the map on the marshal's desk. Etta Finch studied the papers, her expression grim. She tapped the map with a blunt finger. "Cedar Draw. Old Man Hemlock and the Miller family have been ranching that valley for 30 years. The Yavapai consider it sacred ground. If Hale gets his hands on this, he controls everything." She looked up at them. "And this contract, signed by Judge Lyle. It is not worth the paper it is printed on, legally speaking. But a man like Hale does not care about the law, only the appearance of it. This gives him the cover he needs." "So you will arrest him?" Eliza asked, a flicker of hope rising within her. Marshal Finch gave a short, humorless laugh. "With what my authority ends at the town line. Lyle is the county judge. He would have Hale released in an hour and have my star for my trouble. Those men outside work for Hale. The tall one is Decker. He is a bad piece of work." She leaned forward. "You cannot fight Hale here, not in this town. Your only chance is to get this evidence to San Miguel, the district marshal there, a man named Bates. He is honest, and he outranks Lyle." "How do we get there?" Eliza asked, the hope dying as quickly as it had come. "They are watching our every move." Marshal Finch considered them for a long moment. "There is a woman," she said finally. "Her name is May. She runs the Spur. She is a hard woman, but she is fair. She came here with nothing and built her business from the ground up. She has no love for bullies like Hale who think they can buy the whole world. Go to her, use the back door. Tell her Etta sent you. She might give you a place to lie low until you can make a move." Following the marshal's instructions, they slipped down an alleyway and came to the back of the saloon. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food. The back door opened to their knock, and a large woman with fiery red hair and a world-weary face blocked the entrance. It was May. "Marshal Finch sent us," Eliza said quietly. May looked them over, her gaze lingering on Nantan. Etta always was one for collecting strays. She grumbled, but she stepped aside and let them in. She led them not into the saloon proper, but through a cluttered storeroom to a small, clean room that looked out onto a stable. "You can stay here. The stable boy is loyal to me. He will not talk, but do not expect a feather bed and a hot meal." That evening, as they huddled in the small room, the sounds of the saloon a dull roar through the wall. Eliza took out some of her own personal effects from her satchel. Among them was a letter from her adoptive father, a kind, gentle man who had raised her after her own parents had died. She unfolded it, seeking a connection to her old life, a reminder of a world that made sense. She read through the familiar, looping script, his words full of concern for her journey. Then she came to a passage that made the blood drain from her face. "My own work has been quite demanding of late," he wrote. "I have taken a temporary position as a clerk for a prominent land broker who is managing the new railroad expansion. His name is Corbin Hale, a most ambitious and energetic gentleman, though perhaps a bit too sharp in his dealings for my taste. He has had me drawing up contracts and copying survey maps day and night." Eliza let the letter fall into her lap. The room felt suddenly cold, airless. The web was not just around her. It was connected to her own family. The kind man who had taught her to read and write had, with his own innocent hand, helped draw the very map that would dispossess families and desecrate sacred land. The conspiracy was no longer an abstract evil. It had a face she loved. And the bitter realization dawned that the people you trust can betray you without ever knowing they have done so. The escape happened in the hour before moonrise, in a darkness so thick it felt like black wool. May did not waste words. She led them through the silent stable, where the smell of hay and horses was a comfort, a scent of honest labor. She had a small buckboard wagon waiting in the alley, its bed half filled with sacks of flour. "Get in! Lie flat," she commanded, her voice a low rumble. "There's a tarpaulin under the seat. Pull it over you. The night patrol is lazy, but Decker's men are not. They'll be watching the main roads out. I'm just making a late delivery to the Morrison Ranch, south of here. Once we're clear of the town lights, you're on your own." Eliza, Nantan, and Jonah huddled in the wagon bed, the coarse flour sacks a lumpy mattress. Nantan pulled the heavy, greasy canvas over them. It was stifling, smelling of dust and rain and something vaguely chemical. Eliza held Jonah close, feeling the boy's quiet, trusting stillness against her. She could hear the creak of the wagon wheels, May's low murmur to the horse, and the thudding of her own heart. Each sound from the street a distant shout. The closing of a door was a potential threat. Nantan lay perfectly still beside her. She could feel the warmth of his body through their thin clothes, a solid, calming presence in the suffocating dark. He was listening. She knew, not just with his ears, but with his entire being, sensing the rhythm of the town, waiting for the one beat that was out of place. The wagon rolled on for what felt like an eternity. The sounds of Red Mesa faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Finally, the wagon slowed and stopped. "All right," May's voice came from above. "This is as far as I go. The Morrison place is another mile that way. You keep heading southeast. You'll hit the trail to 7 Springs before dawn." The tarpaulin was pulled back, and the sudden wash of starlight was blinding. They clambered out, stiff and covered in a fine white powder. In the dim light, May looked like a formidable ghost. "Etta said you were good people in a bad spot," she said, looking at Eliza. Then her eyes shifted to Nantan. "And I do not like Corbin Hale and the smell of money he brings with him. It poisons a town." She tossed a canvas sack into Eliza's arms. It was heavy with a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and a chunk of cheese. "Good luck." Without another word, she clucked to her horse and the buckboard creaked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving them utterly alone under a vast, silent canopy of stars. The trail to 7 Springs was a treacherous ribbon of earth clinging to the side of the mountains. By midday, the Santa Ana winds had picked up, a hot, desiccating breath that blew from the east. It was not a gale, but a persistent, malevolent force that stole the moisture from their skin and the strength from their legs. It whipped Eliza's hair across her face and flung grit into their eyes. The world became a hazy, brown ordeal. They were navigating a particularly narrow stretch of the pass, with a steep drop on one side. When the wind gusted with sudden fury, it tore at a loose overhang of rock and shale above them. Nantan heard the faint rattle an instant before it happened. "Move!" he shouted, shoving Eliza and Jonah forward, toward the relative safety of the rock wall. A shower of stones and dirt rained down. Most of it was small, but a single, plate-sized rock struck Nantan high on the back, sending him stumbling. He did not fall over the edge, but he landed hard against the unforgiving rock face, the heavy trunk he carried absorbing some of the impact but driving the air from his lungs with a sharp, painful grunt. The slide was over in seconds. Dust billowed and then settled. Nantan pushed himself up slowly, his face tight with a pain he tried to hide. He took a shallow breath, and Eliza saw him wince. "I am all right," he said, his voice strained. But when he tried to lift the trunk again, a sharp intake of breath betrayed him. "Let me see," Eliza insisted, her teacher's voice taking on an authority that surprised them both. He hesitated, his pride a visible barrier. It was not his way to show weakness, to accept help, but the pain was a sharp, insistent truth. He nodded curtly and turned, allowing her to pull up the back of his rough cotton shirt. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming over his ribs on his left side. When she pressed gently with her fingers, he could not suppress a low hiss of pain. "They are not broken, I think," she said, her voice softer now, "but badly bruised. You cannot carry that trunk." For the first time since the flood, their roles were reversed. He was the one who was injured, and she was the one who had to be strong. She took a spare linen shirt from her satchel and, tearing it into long strips, fashioned a crude but effective bandage, wrapping it tightly around his chest to support his ribs. Her fingers were deft and gentle. The brief, necessary touch was a new kind of language between them, a communication of care that went beyond words. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin, the solid feel of the muscle beneath. He stood perfectly still, his breathing shallow, enduring her touch with a quiet stoicism that she was beginning to understand was not a lack of feeling, but a deep, disciplined control of it. Jonah's village was a small, hidden collection of wickiups nestled in a canyon fed by the 7 small springs that gave the area its name. It was a place of profound peace. The wind did not howl here. It whispered through the willows that grew along the water. As they approached, a pack of lean dogs set up a chorus of barking, and people emerged from their homes, their faces curious and wary. Jonah ran ahead, shouting for his mother, and was quickly enveloped in the arms of a woman who wept with joy and relief. Nantan, however, stood back. He was Apache. This was Yavapai land. He was a stranger here, and he would not presume a welcome. He explained their situation to one of the village elders, speaking in a shared dialect, his tone respectful, his words carefully chosen. He asked only for a safe place to rest for a night. The elder listened, his old eyes taking in Nantan's bearing, Eliza's exhaustion, and the story of the flood. He led them to the largest wickiup, the home of the village shaman. An old woman sat by a small fire in the center of the dwelling, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles. Her name was Taya. She looked at them with eyes that seemed to see straight through their skin to the troubles they carried in their hearts. She said nothing for a long time, simply observing them as she fed fragrant herbs into the fire. The smoke, smelling of sage and juniper, filled the small space, but it was not choking. It was cleansing. "You run from a man who wants the water," Taya said at last, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. It was not a question. "You carry his death warrant in your bag." She nodded toward Eliza's satchel. "But the paper is not the danger. The danger is the man who believes the paper gives him the right to own the rain." She looked at Nantan. "And you walk with a foot in 2 worlds, and it makes your soul tired." She gestured for Nantan to sit, and taking a small bowl of white ash from the edge of the fire, she dipped her thumb in it. She gently took his right hand, the one that would draw a pistol, and drew a single, soft white line across his knuckles. "This is a prayer," she said, "so that this hand remembers its purpose. It is not for killing. It is for protecting. A strong man does not need to show his strength until the weak are threatened." Nantan looked at the white line on his skin. He felt the weight of her words, of the vow she was placing upon him. It was the codification of a choice he had already made, back at the flooded creek, a choice to protect rather than to simply survive. He closed his hand, the ash soft against his skin. Later that night, as Jonah slept soundly with his family, Nantan and Eliza sat outside Taya's home. The desert sky was a spectacle of brilliant, cold light. Nantan, moving stiffly because of his ribs, pointed out the constellations to her. He did not call them by their Greek or Roman names, but by the names his people had given them. The Great Bear was a circling group of hunters. The Pleiades were 7 shy sisters. He showed her how to find the steady, unmoving North Star. "If you know that one," he said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet night, "You are never truly lost." She listened, captivated. He was giving her a gift, a piece of his world, a map that could not be bought or sold. In that moment, she was not a proper schoolteacher, and he was not a feared Apache. They were just two people, sharing a small patch of peace under an immense and beautiful sky. The fear of what people in Red Mesa might say, the shame of being seen with him. It all felt small and meaningless out here. What felt real was his quiet strength, the unexpected gentleness in his voice as he spoke of the stars. But she also saw the cost. She saw the way he held himself apart, the profound loneliness in his eyes. She feared for him, feared that by helping her, he was inviting a violence into his life that he had tried so hard to leave behind. Their brief sanctuary was shattered the next morning. An elder approached Nantan as they prepared to leave. He was troubled, a young man from the village, known for his restlessness and his envy of the white man's money, had offered to guide them on a little-known path toward San Miguel. It would be faster, he had claimed. Nantan's eyes narrowed. He thanked the elder and walked to the edge of the village, where the tracks of the young man's pony were still visible in the damp earth. He knelt, studying them for a long time. Eliza watched him, seeing the subtle shift in his posture, the stillness that was not calm, but coiled with tension. He rose and came back to her, his face grim. "The boy's pony is wearing a new shoe on its right forefoot," he said, his voice low. "It makes a clear mark. He has not gone to find a faster path. He has ridden in a circle, and he has crossed his own tracks twice. He is trying to make it look like he has been searching." Nantan's gaze went to the mouth of the canyon, and out there, beyond the ridge, I saw other tracks. 4 shod horses. They are not moving. They are waiting. The betrayal was a cold shock. Decker's reach extended even here, into this peaceful canyon. His money a poison that could turn a restless boy against his own people. The guide had been bought. He was leading them not to safety, but into an ambush. "He thought we would not know," Eliza whispered, horrified. "He did not know that the earth tells a story to those who listen," Nantan replied. The look on his face was hard as stone. The peace of the night was gone, replaced by the grim reality of the hunt. Their enemies were not just behind them anymore. They were ahead, waiting, and they knew the direction they were headed. San Miguel was a city of noise and straight lines, unlike the organic sprawl of Red Mesa, which seemed to have grown from the dust itself. San Miguel was a deliberate act of will imposed upon the landscape. The sharp, parallel lines of the railroad tracks were its spine, and from them grew a grid of streets, a skeleton of commerce. The air did not taste of dust and sage, but of coal smoke, sawdust, and the metallic tang of money. The shriek of a steam whistle replaced the cry of the hawk. For Eliza, it was a frightening, exhilarating taste of the world she had left behind. It was a place where things got done, where laws were written and newspapers were printed. It was a place, she prayed, where justice could be found. For Nantan, it was a cage. The buildings crowded in, blocking the sky. The noise was a constant assault, a chaotic babble that drowned out the subtle language of the wind and the earth. He walked with a coiled, unnatural stillness, his senses overwhelmed but still sharp, cataloging every new threat. The people here did not just stare with the dull prejudice of Red Mesa. They looked through him, as if he were a ghost, a relic of a world they were busy paving over. Jonah clung to Eliza's hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear at the sheer scale of it all. Wagons, buggies, and men on horseback clogged the streets. The buildings were 2 stories high, with glass windows that glittered in the sun. It was a world of bewildering complexity. They did not have to look for Marshalletta Finch. She found them. She was waiting on the boardwalk in front of the land office, looking as out of place and as immovable as a granite boulder in a flower bed. She had ridden hard from Red Mesa, taking a more direct route, and had arrived the night before. "I figured you would make it," she said, her voice a welcome note of dry pragmatism in the city's cacophony. but you have walked into a bigger hornet's nest than you think. Hale owns more than the judge back in Red Mesa. He has friends in the territorial legislature. His railroad company is the future, and this town is drunk on the future. But the district marshal, Eliza began. Marshal Bates is an honest man, Etta cut in, but he is also a careful one. He will not act on your word alone against a man like Corbin Hale. A contract signed by a sitting judge, no matter how crooked, is a powerful thing. You need more than the law. School teacher. You need a public outcry. She jerked her head down the street. And that is where we are going now. She led them to a building with a large sign that read, The San Miguel Sentinel. The windows were smudged with ink, and from within came the rhythmic, clanking heartbeat of a printing press. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of ink, paper, and hot lead. A woman with short-cropped, unruly hair and ink stains on her fingers looked up from a galley of type. She had intelligent, impatient eyes that seemed to take in all three of them and their entire story in a single, sweeping glance. Ida Bell, Etta said by way of introduction. This is Eliza Hart and Nantan. They are the ones I told you about. They have something you will want to see. Ida Bell wiped her hands on a rag and led them to a cluttered back office, clearing a space on a desk piled high with books and papers. Eliza laid out the documents, the fraudulent contract, the surveyor's map of Cedar Draw Valley, and the letter from her adoptive father. Ida read through them, her expression growing sharper, more focused with every line. She did not exclaim or gasp. Instead, a kind of fierce, intellectual excitement began to burn in her eyes. "This is it," she said, her voice a low, excited hum. "This is the proof. Everyone has been whispering about Hale's land grabs for months, but it has all been smoke. This is the fire." She looked up at Eliza, her gaze direct. "You understand what will happen if we print this. Hale will not take it lying down. He will try to ruin you. He will call you a liar, a fantasist, worse." "He's already trying to kill us," Eliza replied, her own voice quiet but firm. "I would rather be ruined in the light than murdered in the dark." A slow smile spread across Ida Bell's face. "Good. Then we will give them enough light to read by in the middle of the night." She began to write, her pen scratching across the paper with a furious energy. She asked questions, sharp and to the point, pulling the details of the story from Eliza the flood, Silas's last words, the riders, the ambush they had avoided at Seven Springs. She was not just a writer. She was a builder, constructing a fortress of facts. The hope in the small office was a tangible thing. For the first time, Eliza felt they were not just running, but fighting back. Nantan stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the street. He did not trust this new weapon of words and paper. It was not a world he understood, but he trusted the fierce determination of the two women in the room. The fortress was breached in the late afternoon. The door to the newspaper office opened, and Corbin Hale stepped inside. He was everything the stories had implied, and more. He was dressed in a finely tailored suit of dark gray wool, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His hair was silver at the temples, and his face was handsome, an image of civilized prosperity. He moved with an easy, confident grace, and his smile was a work of art, conveying charm and a faint, patronizing amusement. He was not a dusty frontier villain. He was a gentleman, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. He was not alone. Behind him stood his lawyer, a man named Whitcomb with a pale, fleshy face and the dead eyes of a shark, and with them was a deputy United States Marshal, a hard-faced man whose authority was absolute. "Miss Hart," Hale began, his voice smooth as warmed honey, "what a pleasure to finally meet you. I was so distressed to hear of the tragedy that befell your coach, a true loss." His eyes flickered toward Nantan. "And I see you have found some unconventional companionship." "What do you want?" Hale Ida Bell demanded, stepping in front of her desk. A small, ink-stained guardian. Hale's smile did not falter. He turned his attention to the deputy. "Deputy, I believe you have a warrant to serve." The deputy stepped forward and unrolled a document. "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of this man," he said, gesturing at Nantan with the paper, "on the charge of interfering with and robbing the United States mail." The accusation was a physical blow. Eliza gasped. "That is a lie! He saved us! He saved the mail!" "A convenient story," Whitcomb, the lawyer, said smoothly. "The driver is dead. The coach is destroyed. The only witnesses are a schoolteacher who has clearly fallen under the sway of her savage companion, and the companion himself, whereas my client, Mr. Hale, had a vested interest in the timely arrival of that mail, which contained legal documents vital to his business. It was a perfect, diabolical lie, a story that the world was already primed to believe. "You cannot do this," Eliza cried, her voice trembling with outrage. "It is already done," Hale said, his charming smile finally showing a sliver of the cold steel beneath. "Deputy, please escort the prisoner to the jail." The deputy moved toward Nantan, who had not moved, had not said a word. He simply stood, watching Hale, his expression unreadable. But as the deputy reached for him, Marshal Etta Finch stepped between them. "Hold on," Etta said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is my town. Federal warrant or no, the prisoner will be processed according to local procedure before he is handed over to your custody." Whitcomb opened his mouth to protest, but Etta stared him down. "That is the law. Counselor, I am booking him here. You can have him in 24 hours, not a minute sooner." It was a small victory, a procedural delay, but it was all she could offer. The deputy, a man who understood the intricate dance of jurisdictional pride, shrugged and stepped back. He would wait. Hale's smile tightened for a fraction of a second, the only sign of his annoyance. He had wanted this done quickly and quietly. Two of Etta's local deputies arrived and, with a grim formality, escorted Nantan from the office. He went without a struggle, his head held high. As he passed Eliza, his eyes met hers for a moment. In them, she saw no fear, only a deep, profound warning. The ticking of the clock in Ida Bell's office suddenly sounded as loud as a drum beat. They had 24 hours. "He will never make it to a federal trial," Ida said the moment the door closed. "Hale will arrange for him to be shot while trying to escape." This newspaper story is not just about land anymore. It is about saving that man's life. The energy in the office became frantic. Ida wrote with a desperate speed, her words filling page after page. Etta stood guard at the door, her hand resting on the butt of her revolver. The sun began to set, casting long shadows down the street. Eliza felt a surge of helpless panic. She was not a fighter, not a writer, not a lawman. She was a teacher. And then she knew what she had to do. "Give me some paper," she said to Ida, "and a pen." While Ida worked on her explosive front-page story, Eliza sat at a small side table, with the meticulous care of a scholar, her handwriting clear and steady. She began to make a complete, exact copy of every document. She copied the contract, word for word. She traced the map, her hand steady, recreating every line and label. She copied the damning passage from her father's letter. It was slow, painstaking work. It was her work. She was bearing witness, creating a second set of truths that could not be so easily dismissed or destroyed. Night fell. The press began to run, its rhythmic clanking a sound of defiance in the darkness. The first few copies of the extra edition of the Sentinel were pulled, the ink still damp. The headline was stark and bold. "Hale steals Valley. Frames Apache savior." It was a declaration of war. The declaration was answered almost immediately. A shout from the street. "Fire!" Ida and Eliza ran to the window. The front of the office was engulfed in flames. Thick, black smoke poured through the doorway. Someone had thrown a torch, or perhaps several. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on the dry wooden structure and the reams of flammable paper inside. Etta Finch burst through the back door. "Out now," she yelled, her face grim in the flickering orange light. They scrambled out into the back alley, choking on the smoke. The roar of the fire was a hungry, living sound. They watched, helpless, as the roof of the newspaper office sagged and then collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. The press, their voice, was silenced, buried in a flaming pyre. Ida Bell leaned against the brick wall of the neighboring building, a cut on her forehead bleeding freely where a falling beam had grazed her. Everything was gone. The story, the plates, the evidence. A profound, soul-crushing despair settled over Eliza. They had lost. Hale had won. "He did it," Ida whispered, her voice hoarse, watching the flames consume her life's work. The bastard burned it all down. In the smoky, hellish light, as the bells of the town's fire brigade began to ring frantically in the distance, Eliza reached into her satchel. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "No," she said, pulling out the sheaf of papers she had so carefully prepared. "Not all of it." She held up her handwritten copies, the ink black and defiant against the white pages. Each letter a testament, each word a promise. The fire could burn the building and the machine, but it could not burn the truth. The chaos of the fire was their salvation. While the volunteer fire brigade clanged its bell and shouted uselessly at the inferno consuming the Sentinel, and while the citizens of San Miguel spilled into the streets to gawk at the pillar of orange flame, Marshal Etta Finch moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a desert hawk. She did not waste a moment. "Whitcomb will have that federal deputy on my jailhouse door inside the hour," she snarled at Eliza in the smoky alley, her voice a low, urgent rasp. "With this fire as an excuse, he will claim the town is unstable and demand his prisoner be moved for safekeeping. We have no time." She shoved Eliza's copied documents, a fragile shield against the consuming fire, deep into the schoolteacher's satchel. "Stay here. Do not move." Then she was gone, disappearing into the swirling smoke and confusion. The wait was an agony of seconds stretched into lifetimes. Eliza and Ida Bell, whose face was now streaked with soot and blood from the gash on her forehead, huddled against the brick wall, trying to be invisible. The roar of the fire was the sound of their hopes turning to ash. Then, from the mouth of the alley, a shape emerged. It was Etta, leading 2 horses, and behind her, his hands unbound, was Nantan. There was no time for questions. Etta had used the fire as a pretext to clear the jail, claiming the flying embers posed a threat. In the ensuing confusion, she had simply walked her single prisoner out the back door. It was a brazen abuse of her authority, an act that would surely cost her the star she wore, but she had done it without a flicker of hesitation. "Get on," Etta commanded, handing the reins of one horse to Eliza. "Ride east, follow the Rio Verde. Do not stop until the sun comes up. There is an old grain store about 5 miles downriver on the north bank. It is abandoned. Hide there. I will try to misdirect them, send them looking for you on the road north." Eliza looked at Ida, her heart aching for the woman who had lost everything. "What about you?" Ida Bell's eyes, fierce and defiant even in her smoke-stained face, met Eliza's. "He can burn my press," she said, her voice raw. "But he cannot burn my memory. I am a witness now. Go, make those papers count." They mounted, Nantan swinging up behind Eliza, his body a solid, reassuring weight against her back. He took the reins from her trembling hands, his touch firm and steady. For a moment, she leaned back against him, drawing strength from his stillness in the heart of the chaos. Then, with a final, grim nod from Etta Finch, they spurred the horse into the darkness, leaving the burning city behind them. They rode in silence, the sound of the horses' hooves a desperate, rhythmic drumming against the earth. They did not follow a road, but kept to the soft ground near the riverbank, letting the gentle murmur of the Rio Verde guide them through the night. The angry orange glow of San Miguel faded behind them, and the vast, peaceful darkness of the desert night reclaimed the world. The air grew cool, smelling of damp earth and willow. The grain store was a sagging, skeletal silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It stood alone, a forgotten relic of some forgotten farmer's dream. The large doors hung askew on rusted hinges, and the wind whispered through the gaps in its board walls. Nantan slid off the horse and helped Eliza down, his hands gentle on her waist. Her legs were shaky, and she leaned against him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, a silent acknowledgement of their shared exhaustion and terror. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the ghostly scent of 1,000 harvests. Moonlight streamed through a high, broken window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny silver spirits. A thick bed of old, spilled grain and straw covered the floor, offering a surprisingly soft place to rest. It was a sanctuary, a temporary pause in a world that wanted them dead. Nantan tended to the horse first, rubbing it down and letting it drink from the river. When he returned, he found Eliza sitting in a patch of moonlight, her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering. It was not entirely from the cold. It was the deep, shuddering release of a body that had been running on fear for too long. He sat down near her, not too close, respecting the space she needed. He began to check the action on his pistol, the familiar, methodical clicks of the hammer and cylinder, a small, solid sound in the immense quiet. He saw her watching his hands, and then her gaze drifted to his side, where he still moved with a certain stiffness. The pain in his bruised ribs, forgotten in the heat of the escape, had returned with a dull, throbbing insistence. "Your side," she said, her voice soft. "Does it still hurt?" He nodded, not wanting to lie. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing," she countered, a hint of her teacher's firmness in her voice. "You took a blow that was meant for me. Let me look at it again. The bandage might have slipped while we were riding." He hesitated for only a moment. To refuse would have been to deny her a way to care, a way to reclaim some small measure of control in their spiraling world. He nodded again and turned his back to her slightly, allowing her to reach for the hem of his shirt. Her fingers were cold against his warm skin, and they trembled slightly as she unwrapped the makeshift linen bandage. In the pale moonlight, the bruise was a dark, ugly shadow on his skin. She examined it with a focused intensity, her touch feather-light and yet profoundly intimate. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his back. He stood utterly still, his body rigid, every sense alive to her nearness. This was a different kind of danger, a vulnerability that had nothing to do with guns or assassins. She cleaned the scraped skin with a cloth dampened with water from their canteen. Her movements were slow, deliberate. He could feel the gentle pull as she wrapped the new, clean strips of linen from her satchel around his chest, her hands moving with a sureness that belied their trembling. The world shrank to this small, quiet space, to the scent of old grain, the sound of the river, and the feeling of her hands on his skin. When she was finished, he did not immediately move away. She let her hands rest for a moment on the new bandage, a silent gesture of completion, of care. The space between them was charged with unspoken words, with the shared trauma of the flood, the chase, the fire. They were no longer just a schoolteacher and an Apache. They were two souls who had seen the bottom of the world together and had survived. She pulled back, and he turned to face her. She was shivering again, her eyes luminous in the half-light, wide with a mixture of fear for what the morning would bring and a deeper, more confusing emotion. She looked at his bare chest, at the fresh white bandage, and then up at his face. 1,000 thoughts seemed to pass through her eyes. He saw the strength that had copied those documents, the compassion that had cared for Jonah, and the profound loneliness of a woman who had always relied on the world of books and rules, only to find it a fragile defense against cruelty. She bit her lip, a small, nervous gesture that seemed to break the dam of her composure. Her voice, when she spoke, was a bare whisper, A fragile thread of sound, half jest and half desperate query. She bit her lip. What happens after I undress? The question hung in the still air, honest and raw and achingly vulnerable. It was not a seduction. It was a plea for warmth, for comfort, for a moment of human connection to ward off the encroaching darkness of the world outside. A slow smile touched Nantan's lips. It was a rare thing, and it transformed his face, smoothing the hard lines and revealing a deep, gentle warmth in his eyes. He understood the heart of her question, the fear and the nascent hope entwined within it. And Apache smiled. Then you'll know, desire. His voice was a low, soft murmur, a simple statement of truth, not a promise of conquest. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that she had been misunderstood, that she had offered too much. He reached out, not to touch her body, but to take the edge of the rough wool cloak he wore slung over his shoulder. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew it around her, pulling her gently closer until she was enfolded with him in its warmth. The cloak smelled of him, of wood smoke and dust and the clean scent of the desert night. He looked down at her, his expression serious now, but still gentle. But tonight, he said, his English simple and direct, we keep each other warm with breath and promises. There is no need to hurry. Desire also needs trust. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear of relief, of gratitude, of a profound and overwhelming sense of being seen, of being understood. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, and he could feel the tension finally leaving her body. They sat like that for a long time, two survivors wrapped in a single cloak, listening to the river flow past in the darkness. There was no passion in the way they held each other, but there was a deep and abiding intimacy, a promise of protection, a commitment forged not in a church but in flood and fire. After a while, a new kind of tremor went through her, a slight wave of nausea. She shifted, pressing a hand to her stomach. He felt it, his senses attuned to her every movement. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low whisper against her hair. She was quiet for a long moment, as if gathering the courage to voice a thought that was still new and terrifying and wondrous to her. "Nantan," she began, her voice barely audible. "There is something else. I am not certain, but I think I may be with child." The words fell into the quiet of the grain store, a secret of impossible weight and significance. The world outside, with its Corbin Hales and its stolen land, seemed to fall away. Nantan went very still. He did not speak. Instead, he slowly moved his hand from her shoulder and placed it gently on her flat stomach, over her own hand. His touch was not possessive, but reverent, a question and a vow all in one. The stakes of their fight had just been raised infinitely higher. They were no longer just fighting for justice. They were fighting for a future, a family. He held her a little tighter, and under the protection of his cloak, they finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, while the river, oblivious, continued its steady, patient journey to the sea. The pale, dusty light of dawn filtering through the broken boards of the grain store felt like an accusation. Eliza woke with a start, her hand flying to her stomach. The memory of the night, the fire, the escape, and her whispered confession to Nantan rushed back in a disorienting wave. He was already awake, standing near the sagging doorway, a still silhouette against the brightening world. He was watching the river, listening. The reality of their situation was a cold, hard stone in her gut. They were fugitives, hunted not just by greedy men, but by the law itself, and she was carrying a child, a fragile, impossible secret in a world that had no safe place for them. The sound of a single horse approaching, moving with caution, made Nantan stiffen. He did not reach for his weapon, but simply faded back into the deepest shadows of the barn. Eliza held her breath. The horse stopped. A moment later, a voice, low and rough, called out. It was Etta Finch. She slid from her horse, looking exhausted, grim, and furious. Her face was smudged with soot, and her star was pinned crookedly to her vest. She had tracked them, just as Nantan would have, by reading the subtle signs they had left behind. She told them she had to circle twice. Hale's men were swarming the roads out of San Miguel, thick as flies on a carcass. She had lost her star. She knew helping a federal prisoner escape was an act she could not talk her way out of. She was an outlaw now. Same as them, but she had not been idle. Before the fire, she had sent a rider, her most trusted deputy, to intercept a man named Silas Reeves, a traveling federal circuit judge known to be as hard as granite and completely incorruptible. Her deputy had found him. The judge had agreed to a private, unofficial hearing. He would meet them, alone, at the mouth of Cedar Draw Valley, tomorrow, at noon. It was their only chance. They had to get those copied papers into his hands. The journey was a slow agony. The single horse Etta had brought was a godsend, but it could not carry them all. They took turns riding and walking, Nantan refusing to ride at all, claiming the movement aggravated his bruised ribs. Eliza knew he was saving the horse's strength for her. The certainty of her condition had settled upon her. The morning sickness was undeniable, a physical reality that made the treacherous journey even more difficult. Nantan watched her with a quiet, fierce attentiveness. When she had to stop, retching behind a screen of mesquite, he simply stood guard, his face unreadable, his presence a shield. He brought her the canteen and a wild root he had dug, one he explained would settle her stomach. It did. His resolve had deepened, transformed from a protector's duty to something more profound, a guardian's unwavering purpose. They traveled for a day and a night, avoiding all roads, cutting across a landscape of rock and arroyos. When they finally neared the coordinates for Cedar Draw, Nantan held up a hand, stopping them. The air was wrong. It was too quiet. The birds were silent. He moved ahead alone, melting into the rocks. He was gone for nearly an hour. When he returned, his face was a mask of cold fury. He said there was no judge. There was only a note, pinned to a cottonwood tree. Eliza and Etta walked forward to see it. A single sheet of paper, nailed to the trunk. The message was simple. The meeting location had been moved. Judge Reeves, it claimed, had been delayed and would meet them at the wooden bridge crossing, 5 miles to the north, on account of unstable ground. Etta swore, a low, vicious sound. She did not recognize the clean, precise handwriting, but Eliza did. Her blood ran cold. She had seen that exact, elegant script on 100 documents in her adoptive father's office. It was the handwriting of Whitcomb, Corbin Hale's lawyer. She whispered the name. It was a trap. Whitcomb had somehow intercepted Etta's message, or perhaps the deputy had been caught. They had been played, led directly into an ambush. They had no choice. The wooden bridge was the only crossing over a deep, dry arroyo for miles. To go around would take days. Days they did not have. They were caught between the hunters they knew were behind them and the trap they knew was ahead. They moved forward, the hope that had sustained them now a cold, metallic dread. The wooden bridge was old, its timbers rattling under the horses' hooves. It spanned a narrow, deep canyon, its walls sheer and rocky. It was a perfect kill box. They were halfway across when the voice echoed from the rim above. It was Decker. He told them that was far enough. He stepped into view, flanked by 4 other men, all holding rifles. They were on both sides of the canyon, holding the high ground. Decker's face was a mask of triumph. He told the schoolmarm to hand over the papers. His associate, Mr. Hale, wanted them badly. Or, he offered, they could all take a long drop to the canyon floor. Etta Finch did not hesitate. She drew her pistol and fired, the bullet striking the rock near Decker's feet. She shouted back at him to go to hell. The canyon exploded with the sound of gunfire. Bullets splintered the wooden railing, kicking up dust and stone. Etta shoved Eliza down behind an outcrop of rock at the bridge's end. Nantan was already gone, having rolled off the side of the bridge, finding purchase on a narrow ledge just below the planking. He was invisible to the men above. Etta was a good shot, keeping the men pinned, but she was one pistol against 5 rifles. The fight was desperate, impossible. Decker, furious at the resistance, leaned out from his cover to get a clear shot at the marshal. It was the opening Nantan had been waiting for. He emerged, not as a man, but as a force, his body moving with liquid speed. He fired from the ledge, his aim steady, his mind clear. He saw the white ash Taya had drawn on his hand. He heard her words. "This hand is for protecting." He did not aim for Decker's chest. He aimed for the threat. The sound of the shot was sharp, followed by a wet, metallic crack. Decker screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and disbelief. His pistol, shattered and ruined, flew from his grasp. He stared at his mangled, bleeding hand. His weapon gone. The canyon fell silent for a stunned second, the echoes of the shot dying away. Into that silence came a new sound, the rumble of a heavy wagon and the pounding of hooves, approaching at a reckless speed. A voice, deep and female, roared over the noise. It was May, the saloon owner, her heavy flour wagon rattling down the canyon road, her shotgun held in one hand like a scepter. She yelled at them to get their dusty hides over here. She demanded to know if they thought she would let Etta have all the fun. She pulled the wagon to a skidding halt, shielding them from the gunman's view. She fired the shotgun at the cliff face above Decker's men, the blast deafening in the narrow space. The spread of buckshot sent stone chips and dirt raining down, forcing them to duck for cover. "Flour delivery," she yelled. Etta grabbed Eliza, and Nantan vaulted back onto the bridge. They scrambled into the back of the wagon, falling among the soft, sturdy sacks of flour. One of them had torn, and a cloud of fine white powder erupted around them, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder. May cracked her whip, and the wagon lurched forward, thundering away from the bridge. Decker, half mad with pain and rage, stumbled to the canyon rim, cradling his ruined hand. He screamed after the disappearing wagon. He yelled that they could not hide from him, that Hale would pay for this. He shrieked that Hale would burn them all, blood or no blood. Etta, reloading her pistol in the back of the lurching wagon, frowned. She asked why he would call Nantan by the name Hale. Nantan and Eliza looked at each other, confused. Decker, realizing his slip in his agony, just spat blood and hatred toward them. He bellowed that Corbin Hale was his half-brother. Corbin got the fancy suits and the name, and he got the dirty work, but he got paid. The revelation hung in the dusty air. This was not just greed. It was a poisoned family, a feud of blood and resentment, making their enemy even more desperate, even more dangerous. May did not drive toward any town. She followed Nantan's quiet instructions. He guided her off the main path, down a dry wash, and toward a narrow crack in the high canyon wall, a path so hidden it was invisible until you were upon it. The wagon barely fit, scraping the rock walls, but it held. They emerged into silence. They were in a high, protected valley, a perfect bowl of green hidden from the world. Springs bubbled from the base of the rock, feeding a clear, cold stream. The air was cool and sweet. Eliza stared, her hand over her mouth. It was the valley from the map. It was Cedar Draw. "My God," Eliza whispered. "It is real." Etta Finch nodded grimly. This, she said, was their courtroom. This was the place they would make their stand. May and Etta could not stay. May had to return to Red Mesa, to her saloon, to be the practical, cynical businesswoman everyone knew. Her absence would be noted. Etta had to leave as well. She had to find Judge Reeves herself, on foot if necessary, and bring him here, to this valley, where the evidence was not just paper, but the water and the land itself. May gave them a sack of supplies, her face set in its usual hard lines. She told them to be safe. her practical words a strange and powerful form of affection. Nantan and Eliza were left alone in the valley. The profound quiet was a balm after the violence of the canyon. The air was soft. The water murmured. Nantan led her to the heart of the valley, to the largest spring, where an ancient, massive cottonwood tree grew. Its branches spread wide like protective arms. The tree was covered in small, faded offerings, bits of colored cloth, small carvings, polished stones. He told her it was a prayer tree. His people had come here for generations, to ask for life, to give thanks for the water, and to make promises. Eliza looked at the ancient tree, then at Nantan's bandaged side, and she felt the small, secret life inside her. They were bound, not by a law or a church, but by flood and fire, by blood and by water. She told him, her voice quiet, that they needed to make a promise to this place and to the child. He understood. He looked at her, his eyes holding a new, deep tenderness that eclipsed all the hardship they had endured. He reached down and took a clean, white strip of the linen bandage she had used on his ribs. Eliza, her hands shaking slightly, tore a long blue thread from the hem of her worn, stained dress. They stood before the tree, their hands brushing. Together, without words, they tied the two scraps of cloth to a low branch, the white linen and the blue thread twisted together. A single, small promise in the quiet breeze. It was a vow, a marriage of two worlds, of two survivors, witnessed only by the ancient tree and the living water that gave the valley its name. They were no longer running. They had found their home. They returned to Red Mesa not as fugitives, but as combatants walking onto a battlefield of their enemies' choosing. Etta Finch had met them at the edge of the valley, her face etched with a grim determination. Judge Silas Reeves had arrived. She told them, and he was every bit as formidable as his reputation. He had listened to Etta's story, his face impassive, and had agreed to her audacious proposal, a public, open-air hearing, right in the center of the town where the corruption had taken root. He believed that justice, to be real, had to be seen by the people it was meant to serve. The main street of Red Mesa was a theater of tense, expectant silence. It was not the same town they had fled. The whispers had been replaced by a low, anxious murmur. People gathered on the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a deep, hungry need to see how this would end. They were ranchers who feared for their water, townsfolk who resented Hale's arrogance, and those who were on his payroll, their loyalty bought but not earned. The stage was a simple freight wagon, parked in the dust directly in front of the saloon. Atop its flatbed sat a single wooden chair and a small table. This was the bench. Seated in the chair was Judge Reeves, a man with a shock of white hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from the stone of the mountains themselves. His authority needed no courtroom. It was a palpable force that radiated from him, silencing the crowd. Etta Finch stood beside the wagon, her star pinned back on her vest, a temporary, unofficial reinstatement granted by the federal judge. She was no longer a renegade. She was an officer of this makeshift court. Nantan and Eliza stood before the wagon, alone in the dusty space that had become the well of the court. Jonah was there too, standing near the wheel of the wagon, close to a collection of rocks he had gathered, his small face serious and watchful. Eliza felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She felt their judgment, their suspicion. She placed a hand on her stomach, a small, protective gesture, a secret promise. Then Corbin Hale arrived. He did not sneak into town. He rode down the main street at the head of a dozen men, Decker among them, his right hand a club of white bandages. Hale was dressed impeccably, a vision of wealth and power. He dismounted with a contemptuous grace, his lawyer, Whitcomb, scurrying to his side. His men spread out, not overtly threatening, but forming a loose, intimidating perimeter around the proceedings. It was a show of force, a clear message that he owned this town and everyone in it. "Judge Reeves," Hale began, his voice carrying easily in the still air, his tone one of polite, wounded reason. "I must protest this spectacle. This is not a court of law. It is a circus, orchestrated by a disgraced marshal and her criminal accomplices. This is a preliminary hearing, Mr. Hale," the judge replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through Hale's smooth tones. "And you have not been accused of anything, yet, for now. You are merely an interested party, as is Miss Hart." Hale gave Eliza a smile that was all teeth. "Ah, yes, Miss Hart, the poor traumatized schoolteacher." He turned his attention to the crowd, his voice taking on a note of feigned sympathy. "A woman who, in her grief, has clearly fallen under the influence of a fugitive savage." His eyes went to Nantan, a man wanted for federal crimes. "I have here a warrant for his arrest, and for hers, as an accessory." Whitcomb stepped forward, holding a document. "And I have a further charge," Hale continued, his voice rising, playing to the prejudice of the crowd, "that this woman, this teacher of our children, has engaged in an immoral liaison with this man, shaming herself and this entire community. And that, in her desperation, she conspired with the newspaper editor Ida Bell to print slanderous lies, a conspiracy that ended with Miss Bell's unfortunate demise in the fire she herself likely set to destroy the evidence of her fraud." A gasp went through the crowd. The accusation was monstrous, a web of lies designed to destroy Eliza's character utterly, to make her testimony worthless. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "That is a damnable lie!" a voice cried out from the edge of the crowd. A path opened, and Ida Bell walked forward. Her head was bandaged, but her eyes were clear and burning with a righteous fury. She was not dead. She was very much alive. In her hand, she held up a single, smoke-stained sheet of newsprint. "I was not in the fire. Hale," she declared, her voice ringing with indignation. "Your thugs said it, but they were too cowardly to make sure I was inside. And while they burned my press, they did not burn every copy of the truth." She held up the paper, the headline stark and damning. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Before Hale could respond, another voice, old and weathered, spoke up. Old man Munoz stepped forward from the crowd, a heavy, leather-bound ledger in his hands. "This man," Munoz said, pointing a gnarled finger at Whitcomb, "he paid me for fresh horses for 4 men the day after the flood, and this other one. He pointed at Decker. He paid me again, a few days later. Gold coin. For information about the Yavapai boys' family, it is all here, in my book. Who comes, who goes, who pays." He slapped the ledger down on the wagon bed. It was a simple record of commerce, but it was an unbreakable chain of evidence that tied Hale's men to the pursuit. The crowd was shifting, the tide of opinion turning. This was no longer just a story. It was real. It was happening in their town. Judge Reeves looked at Nantan. "And you, sir, do you have anything to say?" All eyes turned to the Apache. He had been silent, a statue of stoic endurance. He stepped forward now, and the crowd instinctively drew back. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking at the people. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, and it carried a weight that made every person strain to hear. "I have heard the white man's words," he began. "Savage, fugitive. They are words meant to shame. I am not ashamed of my blood. I am not ashamed of my people." He looked directly at Eliza, a look of profound, unwavering devotion that silenced every whisper. "And I am not ashamed to love this woman. She is my wife. She carries my child." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. He had not denied the accusation. He had claimed it as a mark of honor. "The shame," he continued, his voice growing stronger, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the ranchers and the townsfolk, "is not in who a man loves. The shame is in letting a man like this," he gestured to Hale, "steal the water from your children's mouths. The shame is in watching him take the land that feeds your families, and doing nothing because you are afraid. I am not afraid of his insults. I am afraid of a world where a man's promise means nothing. I made a promise to protect the people I found by the river. I make a promise now, to this woman and to my child. I will not let this man steal their future. He has stolen enough." He stepped back. The silence that followed was absolute, a moment of profound, communal reckoning. The people of Red Mesa were no longer just watching a trial. They were a part of it. Whitcomb, sensing the momentum was lost, made his move. "This is absurd," he shouted, waving his paper. "I have a legal warrant from the county seat. I demand you surrender these fugitives." Decker, standing near Hale, his face a mask of pain and fury, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, a piece of paper from a bought judge. "Whitcomb, is that the best you can do?" Hale shot him a look of pure venom. "Be silent, you useless cripple." Something in Decker snapped. The years of being the dirty-handed relative, the half-breed cousin, the tool to be used and discarded, it all boiled over. He drew his remaining pistol with his left hand. The movement awkward but fast. He fired a single shot into the air. The crowd screamed, scattering back. "This is how you do it. You stake in a suit," Decker snarled. And then he turned, the barrel of his pistol swinging to point directly at Corbin Hale's chest. "You left me to die in that canyon, my own blood." The world erupted. One of Hale's other men, reacting instantly, fired at Decker. The bullet struck Decker in the chest, throwing him backward, but even as he fell, his finger tightened on the trigger. His shot went wide, but Etta Finch's did not. Her pistol was already drawn, and she fired once, a calm, precise shot that struck Corbin Hale in the shoulder, spinning him around. Whitcomb screamed and tried to run, but Munoz's foot shot out, and the lawyer went sprawling in the dust. The entire violent exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. Gunsmoke drifted in the sudden, shocked silence. Decker lay on the ground, his life bleeding out into the red dust. Corbin Hale was on his knees, clutching his shoulder, his fine suit stained with his own blood, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. His men, their leader down, hesitated, their loyalty dissolving in the face of federal authority and a town that was no longer afraid of them. "It is over," Judge Reeves said, his voice a hammer blow of finality. He had not flinched. He stood up, and his gaze fell on the local magistrate, Judge Lyle, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, his face pale with terror. As Reeves watched, Lyle tried to subtly pass a folded piece of paper to one of Hale's uninjured men. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort, perhaps a pre-signed pardon or a writ of release. But he was not subtle enough. Jonah, who had been watching everything with a child's unwavering focus, saw the movement. He remembered the game Nantan had taught him in the desert, a game of watching hands, of seeing the trick before it happened. He did not shout. He simply acted. He darted forward, snatched the paper from Judge Lyle's hand before the other man could even react, and ran with it to Marshal Finch. Etta took the paper and unfolded it. She read it, and a slow, grim smile touched her lips. She handed it to Judge Reeves. The federal judge read the document, his expression hardening into pure, cold granite. He looked down from the wagon bed at the people of Red Mesa. He held up Eliza's copied documents in one hand and the paper Jonah had just delivered in the other. "The evidence presented here," he declared, his voice booming across the street, "is compelling. The public testimony is clear." He looked at Hale, then at Lyle, and the blatant attempt to obstruct federal justice is appalling. He slammed his hand down on the wooden table, the sound as final as a gavel. "Marshal Finch, arrest Mr. Hale, arrest Mr. Whitcomb, and arrest Judge Lyle. This hearing is concluded." The crowd did not cheer. A deep, collective sigh of release, of awe went through them. They had seen it. They had seen justice, raw and real, delivered not in a distant, paneled courtroom, but here, in their own dusty street, on the back of a wagon. They had chosen their side. The aftermath of the hearing was not a celebration. There was no cheering, no riotous joy in the street. Instead, a profound and weary quiet settled over Red Mesa, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. When the air is washed clean and the world feels fragile and new, the sound that broke the silence was the jangle of federal chains as Etta Finch, her authority absolute and unquestioned, led Corbin Hale and his lawyer away. Hale did not look at the crowd. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his wounded shoulder a dark stain on his impeccable suit. Whitcomb wept openly, a pathetic, blubbering mess. Judge Lyle, his face the color of old parchment, was escorted by one of Etta's deputies, his reign of quiet terror over. The town watched them go, and in their passing, a long-held fear began to dissolve. In the days that followed, Red Mesa began to heal itself. Ida Bell, her head bandaged but her spirit incandescent, became the town's focal point. The blacksmith, the same man who had stared at Nantan with such suspicion, offered to help clear the rubble of her print shop. May sent over food and whiskey from the spur. People came with hammers and lumber, their small offerings a communal act of defiance and reconstruction. With a small, borrowed press from a neighboring town, Ida produced a special edition of the Sentinel. It was only a single sheet, but its headline, printed in the boldest type she could find, told the whole story. The water is ours. The law is ours. She detailed the entire conspiracy, from the flood to the hearing, naming Nantan and Eliza not as curiosities, but as the catalysts for the town's own awakening. The paper was passed from hand to hand, read aloud in the saloon and the general store, becoming not just news, but a founding document of a new, braver Red Mesa. A week later, an official dispatch rider arrived for Etta Finch. It was the letter of disciplinary review she had been expecting. She opened it in her office, with Eliza and Nantan present. It was a formal, bureaucratic reprimand for releasing a federal prisoner and orchestrating an unsanctioned hearing. But stapled to it was a second, unofficial letter from Marshal Bates in San Miguel. It was short and to the point. It said that sometimes the only way to uphold the law is to break the rules. It ended with a simple instruction. Keep the star. You have earned it. Etta folded the letters and tucked them away, her face betraying nothing. But Eliza saw the deep, quiet satisfaction in her eyes. It was time for them to leave. The town, in its own halting way, had begun to accept them. People nodded to Nantan on the street. Women would offer Eliza a small smile. But Red Mesa was not their home. Their home was a promise waiting for them in a hidden valley. Jonah's family, grateful beyond words, agreed that the boy could go with them, at least for a time. They saw the bond he had formed with the schoolteacher and the Apache, and they understood that his education now involved more than just one world. The journey back to Cedar Draw was a quiet pilgrimage. They were not fleeing, they were returning. The land did not feel hostile anymore. It felt like a welcoming embrace. When they passed through the narrow crack in the rock, and the valley opened up before them, green and serene, Eliza felt a sense of peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was not a place you found on a map. It was a place you earned. The work began the next morning. Building was a language Nantan understood better than English. He showed Eliza how to mix the mud, water, and straw, the perfect consistency for making adobe bricks. They worked under the warm sun, their hands in the cool, wet earth. It was hard, rhythmic, grounding labor. They dug the clay from the stream bank. They hauled the water. They trampled the straw with their bare feet. Eliza, at first clumsy, soon found the rhythm of it. The repetitive, physical work was a meditation, a way of pressing the memory of the violence and fear out of her body and replacing it with the simple, honest fatigue of creation. Jonah was their diligent apprentice, his small hands shaping his own lopsided bricks that Nantan praised with a solemn gravity. When they were not working with the earth, they were working with words. Eliza used a piece of charcoal to draw letters on a large, flat river stone. She taught Jonah the sounds they made, the way they fit together to form the names of the things around them: Tree, Stream, Home. In the afternoons, When the sun was at its highest, Nantan would take the boy and they would walk the valley. He taught him a different kind of alphabet. The alphabet of the land. The V shape of a deer's track. The five-toed print of a raccoon near the water. The way the leaves of a plant turn toward the unseen presence of more water deep in the earth. Jonah absorbed it all. His two educations, in letters and in tracks, weaving together to form a unique and powerful understanding of his world. They laid the foundation for a 3-room house near the great prayer tree, but not so close as to intrude upon its sacred space. They laid the bricks one by one, the walls rising slowly from the earth, a testament to their patience and their shared purpose. In the evenings, they would sit by their fire, and Nantan would tell her stories of his people, stories of the creation of the world, of Coyote the trickster, and of the spirits that lived in the mountains. And she, in turn, would read to him from the one book she had managed to salvage from her trunk, a volume of poetry, her voice soft in the quiet of the valley. The morning sickness that had plagued Eliza on the journey began to subside. In its place came a deep, abiding certainty. One evening, as she lay on their bedroll, she felt it a tiny, distinct flutter deep within her, a secret message from a new life. She took Nantan's hand and placed it on her belly. She did not need to speak. He went very still, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He kept his hand there for a long time, and she felt a tremor pass through him, a wave of some powerful, unvoiced emotion. The child was real, their family was real, their future was taking root, as surely as the walls of their house. The outside world did not vanish entirely. Once a month, a rider from one of the friendly ranches on the far side of the mountains would make a trip to San Miguel for supplies and would bring them mail. Most of it was for Etta, reports and official documents she would read and send back. But one day, there were 2 letters for Eliza. The first was a single, dirty sheet of paper, the message scrawled in a crude, angry hand. There were no names, no return address. It said that Indians and their women were not welcome, that Hale had friends, and that they would never be safe. It was a ghost's whisper, a reminder that hatred, once planted, does not die easily. Eliza burned the letter, watching the ugly words turn to black ash, but a small, cold seed of fear remained. The second letter was different. The envelope was clean, the handwriting achingly familiar. It was from her adoptive father. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was not long, but every word was heavy with a pain and regret that seemed to bleed through the ink. He had heard the news. He wrote, a sanitized version had reached him, but he had pieced together the rest from a copy of Ida Bell's special edition that had somehow made its way east. He confessed everything. He had been in debt. A foolish investment gone bad. Corbin Hale had found out and had offered him a way-out clerical work, a generous salary, and a quiet loan to clear his obligations. He had been so grateful, so blinded by his own shame and desperation, that he had refused to see the true nature of the work he was doing. He had copied the maps and the contracts, telling himself it was just business. He had signed some documents as a witness, never questioning their legality. He had been a willing, ignorant cog in Hale's machine. The letter was a testament of his shame, an apology that felt torn from the deepest part of his soul, but it was more than that. At the end, he wrote that he had already given a full deposition to the federal authorities. He would travel west at his own expense to testify at Hale's trial. It would mean his own ruin. He knew, but it was the only way to reclaim the honor he had so carelessly pawned away. Eliza read the letter twice, the tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, cleansing release. The last, painful thread connecting her to the conspiracy had been cut, not by an enemy, but by an act of love and contrition. The betrayal had been redeemed by courage. That evening, they finished the last wall of the main room. They had saved one space, a perfect square in the wall that faced east, toward the rising sun. Nantan had traded for it in town, a small, precious pane of real glass. It had cost him a month's worth of cured pelts. Together, they carefully lifted the window into place, packing the adobe mud around its wooden frame, making it a permanent part of their home. As the sun began to set, its last golden rays slanted across the valley. They struck the small pane of glass and sent a single, bright rectangle of light streaming into the cool, dark interior of their unfinished house. It fell across the packed earth floor, a promise of warmth, a patch of pure, unambiguous light. They stood there, hand in hand, watching it, two builders in a quiet valley, letting the light come in. The winter that followed was a thin one, a shallow sleep for the land rather than a deep hibernation. A few light dustings of snow turned the high mesas white for a day or two before melting into the thirsty earth, feeding the deep springs of the valley. For Nantan and Eliza, it was a time of quiet, focused work. They finished the roof of their home before the first hard frost, weaving a tight lattice of willow branches and plastering it with a thick coat of adobe mud. They built a fireplace of river stones, and its steady, hungry warmth became the heart of their small house. They were not hiding. They were nesting. Spring arrived not as a sudden event, but as a slow, gentle awakening. The stream, fed by the melting snows, grew talkative. The cottonwoods along its banks unfurled leaves of an almost translucent green. The valley floor, which had been a pale tan, blushed with the color of new grass and wildflowers. It was a season of quiet, powerful affirmation, a world being reborn. News from the outside world arrived with Etta Finch in the middle of a warm afternoon. She did not look like a renegade anymore. She looked like the law. Her star was polished, her posture straight, and the weary tension that had lived in her shoulders for months was gone. She carried a copy of the Prescott Territorial newspaper, and she read the story aloud as they sat in the shade of the great prayer tree. The trial had been a sensation, with the damning first-hand testimony of Eliza's adoptive father, who had traveled all the way from the east to confess his role, and the unassailable evidence of the copied documents. The case had been swift and decisive. Corbin Hale and his lawyer, Whitcomb, were found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Their federal sentences would be long, ensuring they would never trouble the Arizona Territory again. The fraudulent land contract for Cedar Draw was officially declared null and void, its legal existence erased as if it had never been. And in a final, satisfying footnote, Marshal Etta Finch's disciplinary review had been concluded with a full, public reinstatement and a commendation for her unconventional but effective methods in the pursuit of justice. Ida Bell's article, the one she had rewritten from memory and Eliza's copied notes, had been reprinted in papers across the territory. Etta read its now famous title aloud: An Apache, a Teacher, and the Promise of Water. The story had become a piece of local legend, a cautionary tale about greed and a testament to the courage of a few ordinary people. The names Nantan and Eliza Hart were no longer whispers of scandal, but symbols of an unlikely, powerful alliance. When Etta finished reading, a long, peaceful silence settled over them. The great, complicated machinery of the white man's law had, for once, turned in their favor. The ghosts had been exorcised. The future was truly their own. Their house was finished now, its thick adobe walls cool in the day and warm at night. The small glass window Nantan had bought was its single eye, and every morning it caught the first rays of the sun and threw a bright, hopeful rectangle of light onto the far wall. The house smelled of clay and wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of the herbs Eliza had gathered and hung from the rafters. It was more than a shelter. It was a statement, a place they had built not just with mud and straw, but with their own resilience. One afternoon, they walked together to the prayer tree. They did not carry scraps of torn clothing this time, the emblems of their survival. Instead, Eliza held a piece of new, clean white cloth, bought for her by Etta in town. It was the color of gratitude, together, just as they had before. They tied it to a branch, alongside the now faded strips of blue and white. Their first offering had been a plea. This one was a prayer of thanks. That night, the sky was a vast, deep ocean of stars. So clear and close it felt as if you could reach up and stir them with your hand. Eliza, her body now round and heavy with the child, leaned against Nantan's side as they sat by their small fire. The anxieties of the world had receded, leaving behind a profound and quiet contentment. She smiled, a soft, private expression in the firelight. "The desire is still here," she said, her voice a low murmur. She was thinking of that night in the grain store, of her whispered, fearful question. But now I know something more. The desire to live an upright life, to build something good and true, that is even stronger. He did not answer with words. He simply drew his familiar wool cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around them both, enclosing her and their unborn child in its warm, protective embrace. His arm was a solid, steady weight around her. A moment later, from the high rim of the valley, the long, quavering call of a coyote drifted down to them. It was a sound Nantan had known his entire life, a sound that had often spoken of loneliness and the vast, empty spaces of the world. But tonight, it did not sound lonely at all. It sounded like a song of welcome, a wild and beautiful hymn for the family that had taken root in its home. They did not keep the valley to themselves. They began to share it. Their school started small, a classroom without walls under the shade of the prayer tree. Jonah was the first student. Soon, he was joined by the 2 sons of the rancher who had brought them their mail, and then by a few curious children from the Yavapai village, who would walk the hidden path to spend their days with the Apache teacher and his schoolmarm wife. Eliza taught them their letters, her patient voice a gentle counterpoint to the murmur of the stream. But her curriculum had expanded. She taught them from the law books Etta brought her, explaining the meaning of deeds and water rights, teaching them the language of the powerful so they would never be cheated by it again. Nantan taught the other half of their lessons. He showed the children how to read the earth, how to find water, how to understand the seasons, and he showed them all, Yavapai and white children alike, how to dig the small, clever irrigation ditches that would carry the life-giving water from the stream to the small patch of corn and squash they had planted. It was a curriculum of survival and of hope. One bright, clear afternoon, as the wind carried the sweet, dusty scents of sage and creosote through the valley, it was time. Jonah stood before them, a smoothed piece of slate in his hands. Eliza had written a single, short sentence on it with a piece of charcoal. He had been practicing for a week. He took a deep breath, his small face a mask of concentration. He looked at the letters, then at the world around him, the pieces of his 2 educations clicking into place. Then, his voice small but clear, unwavering in the vast quiet of the valley, he read his first sentence aloud. "This is our home. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people."